Good afternoon. I'd like to call the Board of County Commissioners Land Use Workshop to order. Mr. Merrill?
Actually, Lucia is going to introduce this and then move to Melissa.
I'm sorry, Ms. Garces.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Lucia Garces, Deputy County Administrator for Infrastructure and Development. This is workshop number 2 of a series of workshops that we have planned before you. In your last workshop, you talked a little bit about fiscal sustainability and some of the fiscal components related to growth that Kevin Brickey introduced to you. Today, in keeping with the matrix that's been set up, we'd like to be talking to you about land use policies, and that will really be the focus of Melissa's presentation. And then on January 22nd, we come back to you with infrastructure policies, also looking at sustainable infrastructure policies, how they relate to environmental, economic, and social sustainability. Once we complete all 3 of those, we will come back to you on February the 6th. And in that workshop, our intent is to bring all of these together. So there's a lot of commonality that bleeds over from fiscal to environmental, from land use to infrastructure. So the purpose would be to bring back all of those on February the 6th. On February the 6th as well, we would bring back, Melissa will bring back the community engagement piece and how that could be structured to go out to the community to then receive feedback. Today, we would like to talk to you about the land use component and just tell you kind of briefly what we have in your packet of materials. The first thing is the fold-out that includes the matrix that you saw before, and there was good discussion. We believe that we have captured your comments and concerns in that matrix. If we have not, please let us know if there is something that is missing. We had multiple staff people with handwritten notes and reviewing the recap as well, so we think we have captured everything that you have been that you've identified in the last one. Today, what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about, I'll just talk briefly an overview about how we've grown and what we currently have. And then Melissa will take it off to really kind of the how we grow in the future, where we grow, implications of that, what are the alternatives, and what are some of the policy implications moving forward. We will then repeat that kind of format when we come back to you in the infrastructure workshop on the 22nd as well. So unless there are any other questions or comments about the matrix, we would move into the PowerPoint presentation, which is meaty and chunky and yummy for that matter. So if you are all ready, we're ready to go.
Proceed.
Thank you, sir. So again, this is the policy framework that we've been talking about, the approach. And we will be in the row of land use policies, their environmental, economic, and social sustainability on how we look at our land pieces. I think important too to note, though, is while some of the fiscal and financial implications of this may not be appearing today, they certainly would as we talk about the combination of all of them on February the 6th. The other piece that will be important to this is the work that the consultant will be doing, Tischler Bice, and how that relates to some of our growth-related options and decisions. So again, talking about growth trends, how we've grown, Melissa will then talk more about the how we've grown and decisions we've made that relate to density and FAR, and then approaches if there is an interest to move those trends differently, and how those approaches could be applied. This is a slide many of you have seen. I particularly love it because it just talks about the historical foundation that we really were built on nodes and corridors. Certainly Fort Brooke was our first economic engine with a lot of the activity centered there. Lutz was important to provide some of the lumber and timber for construction as well. If you look at some of the others, Plant City, of course, with a lot of the agriculture, Ruskin kind of being a very unique community, a utopian community that was created years ago. But these were some of the early nodes, and the detail is there on the side for you. However, as time went on, the nodes and the automobile became prevalent. The nodes became diluted, and we began to see filling in of the nodes and the ability to travel without a fixed guideway, a fixed system of sorts, enabled folks to move in between the nodes. And what we have today is a series of infill, if you will, that includes all of the communities of Town and Country and Bloomingdale, very thriving communities, but ones that developed quite differently from the initial nodes in how we began to grow. So some of this balance that we're going to be talking about is really what are the options, what are the lifestyle options, where can we bring back nodes from an infrastructure perspective, how do we center these? They're good for transit-oriented development, a number of community image and community identity. I think there's a piece to all of that. And then how do we ensure that communities like Bloomingdale, like Town and Country, like Carrollwood can still continue to thrive? Lutz is another one. I mean, all of our communities, the 26 communities that we have in Hillsborough offer options. And I think the question then will become for us as we debate this topic, how do we ensure that those options continue to be available in our community? So what do we look like today? As we grew, certainly the Northwest and Central grew a lot faster, built out. When I came to this community, activity was all in the Northwest, but about 300 to 400,000 people in each of those broad, they're not quadrants because there's 3 of them, in those areas, and South County being the area where we are just booming now, and the activity that's going on in South County is often the conversation that we're having when you have land use meetings, or as we talk about infrastructure cost, extension of water and sewer, and the location of facilities. This is another slide that you've already seen of the total acreage. We are about 80% built out in the urban service area, but I think more importantly is this slide, which was introduced to you at one of our earlier workshops in the summertime, that indicates that there's about 17,000, 18,000, and probably more as we update this slide, of acres that have been approved but not yet built. So what that means is there's a certificate of capacity from the water department. These are imminent. These are going to happen, and they represent about 35,000 residential units within the urban service area. So then moving from that, the next piece is, so what's left? What's the gap? And the current estimate is that there's approximately 22,000 acres that are unbuilt within the urban service area. So that means something that isn't imminent, but could be. There could be a PD on it that's been dormant, but there hasn't been a switch that's turned on to actually activate it at this point. Some of it could be wetlands, so really unclear until we take a deeper dive about what is the viability of the 22,000 acres and what is their, if any, ability to influence what that 22,000 acres looks like. I think the important part now as Melissa moves forward is that's the unbuilt piece, but there's an opportunity for redevelopment and infill, and where are those opportunities? And again, there's some initial data that was done. A lot of where we are today is a result of a comp plan and decisions that were made. And so I think Melissa has some compelling information about the levels of density and intensity, both on the residential and the non-residential side of how this community has been built out. So those are my introductory comments. I will turn it over to Melissa to take you down the rest of the ride. If you have any questions, I'm available to to answer them.
Commissioner Smith, you're recognized.
Yes, just a couple of quick questions about these maps that we have in front of us. The approved but unbuilt, so let's see, which one is that? That's, they're not numbered here. Okay, approved but unbuilt. That doesn't that doesn't include anything in the cities, in the city of Tampa?
No, these are just an unincorporated.
Just an
right.
unincorporated. So it's a few years of growth in the unincorporated, not even including the growth that it could occur in the city, in the cities.
That's correct, and I think Melissa will reiterate that the 34,000 units, or wherever we are right now, if you assume 2.3, 2.5 per unit, we're somewhere in the 4 to 5 years of available, entitled residential development.
And then the map after that, the unbuilt parcels is more capacity for growth.
That's correct. I think the caveat that I would put on there, though, is we haven't done the analysis of the quality of those unbuilt acres yet. So as I said, some may be wetlands, but some may actually be approved PDs. We don't know that yet.
And if they, in fact, come in and get the hint that we're looking for and ready to approve more density, that could be several more years of growth capacity.
And I think Melissa will be able to really describe that for you.
All right, thank you.
I think there's one piece that was just brought to my attention. The last time we brought this to the board, there was a question about, yes, but I want to know where these are happening. So when I do rezonings, I'd like to know what's approved or not. We are in the final stages of wrapping that kind of data analysis up. So we're hopeful here that in the next week or two, we're testing it now, we're truth testing it to see where there might be issues. But we think that will then provide that tool that some of you have been asking for, is if I can get that from the OSPRI, where can we get it? Why can't we get it? So I think we're trying to make sure that you have that at your disposal. And now I turn it over to Melissa.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Melissa Zornita, Executive Director of the Planning Commission. To spend a little bit more time on where we've been and how we've developed, we took a look at a comparison of densities, not just for the unincorporated area, but also for all three cities. And on average, we're developing much lower than the comprehensive plan would permit us to develop at. So this just shows averages across each of the jurisdictions, that for the unincorporated area, we're on average developing about 3 units per acre. The comp plan allows, on average, about 6.9 units per acre. And these are some of what the comprehensive plan allows in density. And as you can see, there are a number of areas that are darker colored because they allow for higher density. When you switch to how it's actually developed, it's much less than that. And these are just some examples of utilization of land at different densities, a single-family development that might be a little more dense than what we have typically seen in the unincorporated area, but at 3.5 dwelling units per acre, a multifamily development at 13.5. Just to give some illustration to that some increment of increasing the density doesn't necessarily have to be a scary thing if it's designed well. It can, in some of these infill opportunities, that could be an opportunity to consider how we could utilize our land better. Similarly, when we look at the allowable floor area ratios, the comprehensive plan, the lowest floor area ratio that it allows is a 0.25. And in none of our jurisdictions are we meeting a 0.25 FAR on average. They're well below that. And that can be a result of a number of factors, some being the real estate market, but also things like parking and stormwater and those requirements and how they factor in to how people develop on their properties. Again, a similar series of maps showing what is allowed by the comprehensive plan under the floor area ratio for non-residential development, and then how it's actually developed. And these are just, again, some illustrations of some different levels of development. The new USAA building at 301 and the Crosstown Expressway is a 0.38 floor area ratio, for example. So as Ms. Garces mentioned, we have been on average countywide growing at about 20,000 people per year. That equates to needing approximately 12,000 jobs on average per year for those folks. That's the equivalent of adding one city of Temple Terrace every year. And of that, the cities, I would say in general, they're accommodating about a quarter of that growth. About 3/4 of that growth is going in the unincorporated area. So that's a lot. If that trend continues, which I don't have a crystal ball, I don't know what the real estate market's going to do. It can go up and go down. But if we continue to develop at that pace and in the pattern that we have, it's going to mean that we need to look outward. If we don't change the densities, the floor area ratios, the type of pattern that we've been developing out. We would need to look at outward expansion. There would probably be some market-driven redevelopment and intensification just at the rate that we're seeing now. And we'd continue to need to focus our investment on roadways. That scenario would cause for expansion into 54,000 acres of land in the rural area. That has some significant financial and service implications in terms of the amount of impervious surface, new streets, water consumption, a whole host of different factors. And those are all things that you've said you'd like us to do differently. So we've been listening to what you've said over the series of workshops that we've had with you, and what we're hearing is that you want a different future. So we looked at one scenario. This scenario matches what the MPO utilized in their long-range transportation plan. It does not mean that you're locked into that scenario. This is the opportunity to refine that with your input and direction. But this scenario would focus most of the growth in the urban service area. It would rely on transit investment to guide some future growth into the city, into areas like Brandon and the university area where there's the opportunity for some transit-oriented development. It would also rely on some strategic expansion areas like the I-4 corridor. Plant City has some strategic expansion in their Northeast Master Plan. And then, of course, you have asked us to look at what to do with the RP2 and the Waimama Village areas, and we're in the process of studying that. And so that's just one example of how this could play out. There's a whole host of scenarios that we could play out. But listening to what you've said and looking at all of the studies that we've done, the county's done, and many of which we presented to you at the October 24th workshop, looking at what's in the community plans and in the comprehensive plan today, we've got some suggested approaches and some examples of how that might play out going forward. So we tied these to the different boxes on the matrix. In the land use and environmental sustainability box, and I should say at the outset, it was hard to put them into the different boxes because a lot of these issues overlap the boxes and they all interrelate. So which box they went in was often a point of debate amongst staff. But under what we put under land use and environmental sustainability were the issues related to natural resources and looking at the opportunities to increase the acreage of natural preservation lands and avoiding incompatible land uses proximate to those, looking at opportunities to increase water conservation and protect the environment, water sources, and surface waters, to look at the interconnectedness of water resources and match the right resource to the right use, and continue to implement coordinated land and water management processes that are implemented through the land development regulations to protect things like significant wildlife habitat, create wildlife corridors and connections between things like ELAP lands. And we've been doing a good job of this, particularly through the ELAP process. This is just an example map of some of those properties that have been acquired or are approved to be acquired. And you can see how they're starting to create connections throughout the community. So the next area that we put under environmental sustainability and land use was maximizing existing infrastructure. In the 10 years from 2008 to 2018, 90.4% of new building permits were inside the urban service area, and 9.6 outside the urban service area. So we're doing a pretty good job over the past history of focusing growth in the urban service area. That is getting harder as the properties, as Ms. Garces showed on the maps, are becoming more limited in the urban service area. The easy pieces are gone, and you're having really challenging proposals put in front of you at your land use meetings. But we could continue to focus on accommodating the growing population in the areas of existing infrastructure within the currently adopted urban service area and make that the first priority through and strengthen land use policies to maximize the utilization of the land, getting to those charts about the floor area ratio and the density, see how we can better utilize the remaining land that's in the urban service area, and look at tools like transfer of development rights to achieve those goals. Also look at innovative solutions to meeting increasing service demands like low-impact development and green infrastructure. Next, moving to the next box in the matrix, we're looking at land use and economic sustainability. And here we put together some policy language about nodes, focusing on transit-oriented development, creating density bonuses and incentives and even inclusionary zoning requirements for affordable housing that's close to employment centers, mass transit, shopping, all the things that those people need, and creating mixed-use activity centers that have improved connectivity and mixes of uses. So it's just some of the examples. If under a scenario, we looked at transit-oriented development in the red blobs that are kind of hard to see underneath all these lines, but just in those limited station areas, those station areas could accommodate 1 out of 4 new residents and 1 out of 3 new jobs. So there is a significant impact that an investment in transit could have on shaping the development pattern and accommodating new growth. We also used the example of a study that was done in conjunction with the county and the MPO on Brandon corridors and mixed use, looking at focusing on some of the existing centers along the major corridors in that community. The feedback we got from the community was that they really wanted to focus intensification and redevelopment in the 2 areas in the red squares up closer to State Road 60. The other centers, they wanted to see things more walkable, maybe some of the parking lots filled in, but not necessarily having higher densities and intensities. But that gives us a step towards a direction to perhaps pursue to focus some growth in an otherwise today suburban community. The next area we looked at was fiscal sustainability, and this focused predominantly on the issue of jobs and economic development. As Ms. Garces said, the financial implications of these different growth scenarios will come back when Tischler-Bice has completed some of their work at a later workshop. But this focuses on how can we preserve opportunities for people to work near where they live, to have a better balance between jobs and housing. So protect strategically located office and industrial sites that we have today, and create some incentives for developers to include those uses within their developments. Incorporate economic and fiscal analysis into our evaluation of plan amendments and other larger projects, so that we're understanding those implications as we make changes to the comprehensive plan or implementing other programs, and then exploring potentially new employment centers in strategic areas like the I-4 corridor. So just as an illustration, these are some slides the county had put together that illustrate that the commute times are on the map on the left, the more orange or red areas have really long commute times, 40 minutes or greater. And that's the direction where a lot of the residential growth is going in South County. That the reason those commute times are longer is there's not a lot of employment in those areas. So they have to drive to West Shore, to downtown, to the university area for work. This is a map from the Economic Development Department illustrating some of the existing identified competitive sites. And I should emphasize, all of these red areas are not all approved. The entire acreage is not necessarily approved for economic development uses. Something like Waterset that shows up there in South County, a portion of it is for employment and a portion of it's for residential. But as you can see, the sites are fairly limited. And so the idea of protecting these sites from converting to some other use in the future is what might be one approach. And then looking at opportunities to build that inventory, either through incentives to developers within the existing urban service area to include employment uses within their development, or to look at future expansion along a corridor like I-4 that has been studied by the Urban Land Institute in the past. They looked at 3 and recommended the potential for 3 nodes along that corridor. Our red outline kind of covers a broader area encompassing all 3 of those nodes. And then the last area in the matrix is land use and social sustainability. And so in this area, we put maintaining a rural lifestyle, and that could mean making sure that we're avoiding conflicts with the market viability of agricultural uses in the rural area. It also could look at retaining the rural residential character through something like rural design standards. The map here is simply an area in the southeastern Hillsborough County, and depicts areas that are already zoned agricultural in that area. So those might be the types of areas that you might look at to have some design standards or some sort of preservation to maintain those agricultural uses. The form of development is something you all have talked a lot about. It also is something that comes out in a lot of the community plans about wanting to create a sense of place in activity centers and areas within their community that are more walkable, that have a mix of uses, that reflect that the unincorporated area is not a one-size-fits-all place. Ruskin is very different than Gibsonton, is very different than town and country, and that we need to reflect that the community is different in each of those areas with different form of development, different design, and perhaps look at some of our standards that have been in place for years about density and floor area ratio, parking standards, building heights, to see how we can better create the form of development that's desired. We also put in this section incentivizing redevelopment, looking at the opportunities to create reinvestment, particularly in some of our commercial corridors, as an opportunity to accommodate additional growth in those areas, opportunities for public-private partnerships, looking at different approaches, impact-based or place-based approaches to infrastructure funding, adaptive reuse of vacant or underutilized buildings, and making sure that as we do that, we're also not displacing the existing population in those redevelopment areas. And this map just illustrates some of the potential for redevelopment. This is one indicator looking at the building value on a property versus the value of the land. So when the value of the land is greater than that of the building, there's a greater propensity that somebody would redevelop it. And so this is simply a look at the commercial properties that were and where those indicators were present. And the point being that many of them kind of cluster around our commercial corridors. Those are the opportunities, particularly some of the older corridors. We also looked at community vitality and engagement, looking at bringing in health and all policies into our policymaking, how we can ensure preservation and enhancement of recreational, cultural, and historic assets in our community, and foster community identity and that sense of choice of rural, suburban, and urban within our community. And again, we just have an example of one indicator that might be something we would look at through a health and all policies lens. These are communities of concern that have been identified as having two or more characteristics such as low income, disability, youth, elderly, limited English proficiency, minorities, or carless households. So obviously those with more are areas where you might want to focus on some of those efforts. They also often correspond with where there are food deserts and things of that nature that could be addressed through incorporating a health and all policies lens. We also in this section looked at housing and maintaining a range of affordable and attainable housing stock to meet the needs of the community and supporting greater flexibility on things like parking and land development requirements for affordable housing projects, and tying that to infrastructure improvements that might be needed to facilitate that. I know you all have had discussions about how in the university area, there are areas that still are on septic tanks. And so what kind of infrastructure improvements might be needed to make that affordable housing in that area a reality? So that concludes what we have to present in terms of approaches for you all to consider. This is a very valuable opportunity for us to get input from you all on where there's consensus for us to begin to pursue making policy changes. We're not looking to go forward with making changes in areas that you all aren't interested in. So any feedback you have would be greatly appreciated at this point.
Ms. O'Neill, thank you very much for your presentation. Let me ask you a question, because in this entire presentation, there was nothing talking about population projections for the next 20 years. I've asked about that before. Didn't the MPO do a population projection for geographic areas? Am I correct?
Yes, actually, the Planning Commission did that and then the MPO utilized that to run their transportation models to determine what transportation needs would be need to go into the long-range transportation plan.
But did it also look at population growth?
Yes.
Why was those things not included in here?
The scenario that I showed you matches what was the population projection and allocation. I can go back to it here. The one that showed, let's see if I can get back. this map. This future scenario matches the projections and allocation of that projected population that was utilized in the long-range transportation
How
plan.
many years out?
It goes out to 2045.
Okay, what are the numbers?
It's approximately 600,000 more people, and that was using a base year of 2015, looking out to 2045. That's approximately 600,000 more people and 400,000 more jobs.
Okay. I think that needs to be put in there somewhere so we can see that. That needs to be a visual thing that we can see, because that,
Okay.
saying it is one thing, looking at it, it's a whole different ballgame. That's a lot of
Absolutely.
people, a lot of people.
It is a lot of people, yes, sir.
Commissioner Oberman, you recognize.
Thank you very much for your presentation. A lot of this is having the visual is helpful. Where we are right now in the Tampa Bay area is 100,000 affordable housing units short. So in many of your presentations, we talked about, we have 34 or 58,000 units or left. We're already short 100,000 without having another 600,000 people come here or 66,000 more people arrive in the expansion areas. So it is very clear that our floor ratios and our density ratios have got to increase significantly to address just the people who live here, much less the folks that are going to continue to show up because of climate migration. The other challenge we have is about 34 to 45% of the citizens that live here are already house burdened. So that shortage of affordable supply is also creating a great deal of family stress. And then you add a terrible commute to it or no cars, which cuts off all kinds of opportunity, and lack of investment in transit or connectivity. It does cause an awful lot of problems. What's really fascinating in the earlier presentation that Ms. Garces gave, every bit of the growth of our communities for the history of this area has been based on where the rail was. I mean, transit drove where we grew for 100 years. And that's great. But we don't do that anymore. We've been relying primarily on road structure to help us get there. And the worst commutes, based on your illustrations, show where we have lack of road infrastructure to allow those individuals to get around easily, and no transit of real value. Especially after the HART had to cut a lot of its routes due to underfunding prior to our potential of having revenues down the road. So, and I just left this, whatever we call this thing, the regional competitive, the State of the Region report, and they said key factors on our economic success, on our competitiveness, are going to be how we address affordable housing and how we invest in transit and marrying the two. I didn't make that up, but it is true. So, the densities that we have, even in our inside of our urban service area, are not sufficient to meet the needs that we are planning for. Increasing or eliminating single-family occupancy building in areas that are in rural areas may be what we have to do in order to encourage density in other areas, which is why the TRDs or transferable development rights program will have to create the appropriate incentives to meet the density that we need to address the 100,000 housing unit shortfall. So while I appreciate the example used in the Brandon area, where one area is looking for more density and the other area is somewhat not, that whole area needs all of it, because it does have some transit service, which is great. And it can actually be augmented if we were ever able to negotiate some piece of the CSX lines in those areas in the future. So, especially since there's two lines that run right by it. But I'm curious about how we get there. Earlier today, we were talking about a couple of projects coming up, and And I've said grid in the past. But what I haven't said is minimum block size. So apparently I wasn't saying the right words. When we allow a block that's actually, 60 blocks long, that's not a block in my opinion. It's, it's a loop. It's basically, a bunch of houses in a bag with one way in, one way out. And while we may be getting some really nice movement by our planners and our developers that are looking for ways to build in ways that their projects get approved, it doesn't solve the problem if we don't create the connectivity truly. If minimum block size is so big that it doesn't create a block and doesn't create the grid, we don't have walkable communities. We just have big open loops that tie into major arterial collectors that are not safe, which defeats the entire goal of Vision Zero. So we have hard work to do when it comes to our zoning and our comprehensive plan. But I'm sensing from all the folks I've spoke to, both at the city level and the county level and the staff, that there's a lot of opportunity here. And so I'm looking forward to a real conversation about how we marry our land code, our transit efforts in supporting transit development, and where we do that through our incentives plan, our incentives program, whether that be economic incentives for businesses or for residential development. Especially given that right now it appears through ULI report, in concert with the reports we've looked at in the past, that multifamily housing is a very attractive part of real estate development right now. We have an opportunity, if we have the courage to deal with NIMBY kind of things, or our inability to actually make the code work with what we're looking for. So the land code is the question. How do we, in this process, incorporate changes to our land code and our transportation specs to get what we're looking for? And I think that's an important piece of this whole process. I see that we're discussing a lot of these things that we'd like to accomplish, but there are some key elements in our land code and in our road design specs that interfere with us being able to get where we need to go. And it makes it very frustrating for the building industry. And I'd like to figure out if we could incorporate that maybe in the workshop 2 down the road. But this really drives that conversation in terms of what's the challenge. So thank you very much for your work, because you've made it very clear we've got a problem we have to solve.
Sure, and I would just emphasize that that's why we work so closely with Ms. Garces and Mr. Gormley and Mr. Lyons, because it's not a comprehensive plan thing, it's not a land development code thing, it's all of it, and it all has to fit and work together. So we really have to be working in partnership like we are to make the changes implemented.
Commissioner Merman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a few questions about some slides, so
Sure.
y'all can bear with me. As I went through, I had quite a few questions, and I'm not sure, based on our discussion at our last meeting, I don't feel like, this is a great presentation, but I don't feel it picked up where we left off. I feel like we still aren't zeroing in on things that we talked about at the last meeting. I do have a question about the population projections, because you're saying 20,000 people. Is that an average?
That is an average.
How many years?
That's an average over the last 8 years of, I take that back, 7 years, of how much has grown, how much we countywide have grown.
But Commissioner Merman, what she just said about the 600,000 over 25 years, that increases to 24,000 a year.
Well, I know, and I really thought we were in that range of 24 to 30, more realistically. I mean, that's what I remember. I sat in the MPO for 8 years, so I guess I'd just like to make sure that we have the correct numbers on that, because it does change the picture if it's different than 20,000. average? Because I think that one year we had 48,000 people. Didn't we have some outstanding number that came in here? Brandon. I made a lot of points about Brandon. I think that's the perfect hub, especially for transit-oriented development. I see that, yeah, I think that could be strategically a great job center. I think that's a really huge area for redevelopment. And we'd have to, of course, incentivize that, but redevelopment's not free. I mean, even though it's developed, I mean, it's like redevelopment is like starting over. So I guess I think I'd like to see maybe a clearer map, maybe at the next workshop, of where the jobs are going. I know from CareerSource, the two communities that have the most people looking for jobs that are coming to CareerSource centers are coming from Riverview and Town and Country. So I think we need to kind of marry this population growth, where it's going, where the job growth is going, and then kind of figure out, map-wise, how we're going to accommodate this increase in density, increase in people coming in, and where we're going to put the density. Because I can tell you, Brandon's perfect, I-4 corridor is perfect, up near 75 and USF is perfect. There's some really strong areas that we can incentivize and have growth, and we could make them into nodes because they'll have jobs in transit. And I think all that's got to work together. And I think, I guess maybe I was hoping today we would see the recommendation from either one of you of where these nodes would be going forward. So I don't know if you want to address that.
I would simply say that in the time between the last workshop and this one, what we drew on was the examples of studies that we had worked on, like the work that was done in the Brandon area, and identified some nodes, but certainly we could bring back how that might apply in other areas of the county as well.
Okay.
I think, too, to follow on, as we think about the infrastructure and we think about where we focus infrastructure investments, nodes become really important, either for job growth, affordable housing, transit-oriented development. So I think between now and next time, we can start shaping those nodes for that really do have those opportunities.
Because in redevelopment, obviously the infrastructure is going to have to be improved because you're probably increasing your density in that area. So how are we going to pay for the infrastructure? Is that going to be out of our general revenue? Or are we going to incentivize developers or do a swap, or have some arrangement with people that are redeveloping? What do y'all think?
So part of the reason why we're not at a point today is because there's a key philosophical policy decision that needs to be made, because those nodes, I-4, RP2, are outside the urban service area. So the map that MPO, or the population projections that MPO relied on, that Melissa talked about, has over 100,000 people going into the I-4 area and RP2. Those are outside the urban service area, which I think is an issue that the board has not given direction on. So what we're dealing with is two different models. If we're going to go with a model that forces density inside the urban service area and into the cities, that's a completely different picture than going with nodes, which the population projection shows, that are outside the urban service area. Completely different service, completely different infrastructure, completely different cost structure. But in order to start that process, we need really to talk about what is the policy direction. And it doesn't have to be one or the other. I mean, clearly, we can do both. You can have more density, but you can also take advantage of the natural nodes that even in the MPO study, the consultant recognized are viable growth areas. So the hybrid is you take the best of both. So, I mean, a fundamental issue here is that, as Melissa said, we've got more allowable density in the comp plan than is being used. And you got to ask the question, why? I mean, if the market isn't doing it, and they can, that's a fundamental market question. There then is a follow-on question, which is, to what extent should any government become involved in driving a market that apparently doesn't want to take advantage of a rich source of economy, which is available. So that allowable density that's not being used, they don't have to pay for that. All they have to do is come in and ask you for it. Now, the TDR discussion is really at odds with that, in a certain sense. It isn't something that's at odds in the sense of that we can't solve, but it's a different approach. Because if what you want is more density, you don't want to make people pay for it. So then we have to have an incentive program, which I think is what Commissioner Overman's talking about. So incentivizing anybody to do anything means there's a cost. And the cost is in one of two forms. Either you write them a check, or you waive fees, or you give them a holiday on real estate taxes. But all of those cost something. I mean, but that doesn't make it bad. It's a business choice. But it goes back to the philosophical underpinning, which is, does the board want to go completely to a model of forcing density inside the urban service area, or to a hybrid which does that but also acknowledges the opportunity for nodes that are outside the urban service area? Once we kind of wrestle that to the ground, then we can really come back with some hard examples, because then we can assign costs. So the other thing that hasn't been done yet, and it's not a part of the presentation, is the cost. So to make the assumption that creating more density produces a lower cost of service may not be accurate. It's a different kind of cost than the kind of cost that goes with urban sprawl. So that's a whole part of the analysis that we need to ground in reality, and Tischler, Bice, and our other consultants will help us do that. But we shouldn't just start from a place where, more density equals less cost of service. That needs to be validated before you make a big decision on where you're going to push growth here. So I think the point is, there's still a lot of discussion that's necessary before we can run numbers and give you hard recommendations. We can start showing you options, though.
Yeah, that was very good. Thank you for going through that. I think we need to start, as a board, to make the list of the very important decisions we have to make. Because we can sit here and keep talking about all this stuff all day, but we all know what the big decisions are. And if we don't do that, we can't develop the policies around that. And the big example for me was this map of allowable densities and what we actually developed. And I know everybody keeps saying, oh, we allowed too much. Guess what? We didn't. We didn't allow near what we could have. So I think, what you just framed right there, that needs to come back to us one meeting, and we need to, yes or no, up or down, this is what we need to do. Because that's the future course, the future direction of where our policy discussion is going to go. Because I wrote this one comment at the end, if I can find it. I had a lot of comments about all this stuff. But it really is, at the end of the day, we're looking at jobs, people, and housing. And we need revenue. And our growth needs to happen to produce a sound tax base. So whatever these questions are framed have got to revolve around that point.
Yeah, and so the jobs thing is interesting because absolutely, for a lot of reasons, for people's sanity, for cost of service, we would prefer to have people, all of us would rather live closer to where we work. But Ron Barton and Lindsay Kimball will tell you, it ain't that simple. Companies make decisions on where to locate based on a lot of things and not necessarily on where the government wants them to go. So then you get into a different kind of incentive battle, which is if a company wants to go where we don't want them to go, for a lot of other reasons, you need to start stroking big checks and cutting deals to get them to go someplace else. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a cost. It's a business decision.
Right.
And in the end, the cost of incentivizing them to move to a place that's closer to transit might be in the long run cheaper to us, right? So, you know, Commissioner Miller and I and Lucia were over at the school board this morning meeting with Melissa Snively and Jeff Eakins, because there's right now 4 schools that they've asked us to opine on. And, you know, we had a really good conversation, I thought, which is right now, looking at those 4 schools, it's going to cost us over here on this end of Kennedy a heck of a lot of money out of our general fund to provide sidewalks, water and sewer to where they want to put the schools. Now they are in a tough spot because if they're out buying land in competition with the private market, that's expensive. So they agree that their challenge of acquiring parcels that are the best parcels is a cost issue. And so I said, and what we agreed on was, we're going to look at this holistically, and in a couple of weeks we're going to get back together, and if there's another piece of land somewhere else where the cost of us and everyone providing service is lower, but the cost of the land is higher, I would rather recommend to you all, we stroke a check to help them buy that other piece of land, because in the end, we all pay less, kids don't have to walk in dangerous roads, you get more of a community school. So, I mean, those are the kind of decisions that factor into this as well. So but you can't make a company move jobs where you want them to, and
No,
they
but
try.
you can incentivize.
You can incentivize.
And really, we do have some tax credit policies here, but those probably need to be looked at
Yeah.
in relation to all this. If we're talking about prosperity and building a tax base,
Right.
that's what we need to do.
Yeah, we
But-
have the tools. We have the tools. It's just now employing them in a different way, but also being willing to accept a higher upfront cost, which in the long run may pay back. So there's, again, nothing wrong with doing that. It's just a business decision.
I mean, development's going to have to pay its fair share, but
Yeah,
it's got to be in the
right.
context of this major decision we have to make.
Right, it's both sides
And
have to
I had
play.
more questions, but I see a lot of people in the queue, so I'm just going to meet with you separately. But I made my major points, and that is, bring us back the tough stuff and do it now so we can move forward.
Commissioner Hagan, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just going to make a couple of quick comments and then give direction on what I'd like to see. And I think Mike really touched on a lot of it. After sitting through a number of, or dozens of these workshops through the years, there's a few things that I'm fairly certain on, and I'm going to ask Melissa and Lucia to correct me if I'm wrong. I remember a couple of years ago, Melissa telling this board that we're either going to have to drastically change our infill policies and/or expand the USA to accommodate the future growth, right?
Yes.
We know that we have a shortage of competitive sites to meet our economic development needs. I know that's been stated. If you look back at the ULI report, and I'm somewhat paraphrasing, I don't have it in front of me, but they said that we should be thoughtful and deliberate in expanding the USA. I'm focusing on the bullet that was on the fiscal sustainability slide, and it said explore opportunities for new employment centers in appropriate areas such as the I-4 corridor with opportunities for people to live near where they work. I know for at least 10 years, if not longer, that we have considered changing our I-4 policies. I specifically remember an evening vote, when it was 4-3, that we voted not to move forward on it in 2010, but I know it started even before that. I feel that we should start with the ULI report and study I-4 at a minimum at the nodes that were identified in the ULI. Now, I'm not saying that we should go gangbusters forward today on anything, but we should plan for our future growth, particularly with respect to having the necessary competitive sites for future job centers and commercial growth to accommodate the 400,000 jobs that are projected. I know right now that we're going to potentially have one incredible economic development opportunity on I-4, but it's just outside the urban service area. And it's my understanding many, if not all, the commissioners have been briefed on this as well. So all I'm really saying is that we should strategically study and be prepared for future growth in appropriate areas. And I think I-4, for a lot of reasons, makes a lot of sense. By taking this approach, it allows us to, for our other truly rural areas, to remain rural. Then I know that is a priority of this board, particularly for Commissioner White. So essentially all I'm saying is that I agree. I hadn't thought of the term hybrid approach, but I think Mike stated it well, that we should move forward with a hybrid approach, and that we should start by studying I-4, start with the ULI report, at a minimum for the nodes that were identified on I-4. So that's the direction I'd like to see.
Thank you, sir. Commissioner Smith, you recognize.
Thank you. So the population projection is based on the trends that have been happening. And the trends that have been happening, as identified here, is that in the last 7 years, 20,000 people a year moved into the county. That happened. That includes over 5,000 people a year moving into the city of Tampa. So a little over 14,000 people a year moved into the unincorporated area in the last 7 years, which is a pretty hot market. I asked why we start at 2012. Well, if you start at 2010, it drops quite a bit to an average of 16,000 people a year total, again, counting the city. So it's, 12-ish, 11-ish, 1,000 a year in the since 2010. What we have to, but the more important question to me is not how many are coming, because we don't have a crystal ball. It's not like projecting the weather. It's not like these people are going to rain down on us. It's a lot of policy decision. It's a lot of, what happened before, and are we going to keep on doing the same thing? The more important question is, how many can we afford? Because every single house costs us money. We've known this since Bob Hunter was in charge of the Planning Commission and commissioned the field model report that showed we were losing so many $1,000s a house. We're losing a lot more $1,000s a house now since we haven't raised impact fees. So when we talk about land use policy and economic sustainability, we need a bullet in there that is fiscal responsibility, economic sustainability of how much are us taxpayers spending to accommodate each house, each subdivision, each batch of each subdivision. And it is more, the more you sprawl, obviously. It costs more to spread your infrastructure out farther than to focus it in smart growth, transit-oriented development where every single person in the house doesn't have to own a car. So, I think that we have to keep that context in mind when we're talking about how we want to grow. The ULI did say some things about the I-4 corridor. Their main point was be careful about, do not consider expanding the urban service area for the next foreseeable few years down the path. So I'm really happy that this board has, started out with some tough discussions and begun to find where we have common ground. I think this framework that we've been working on really, it started out very well and it's gotten better. And it really, I see it incorporating a lot of the things that we've said, and I see a lot of common ground. And I think, if we start stepping out with policies and land development code suggestion on the things that we do clearly agree on, we can then start building on that and stepping out into the things where we still have a lot of discussion to go. The I-4 corridor for me is a place where we still have a lot of discussion to go. Not that I'm not open-minded to nodes and things out there, but that's going to be, I think, more controversial than some of the other stuff that is in this this report that you've brought back. The RP2 and WVR2 areas, I'm really hopeful that we've bought some time and we are working together towards figuring out how we're going to deal with those areas. But there's a lot to figure out there, and we do need to work with the communities. Within the short time frame of the moratoriums that we've bought for ourselves, I do want to make sure that when we have this February 6th workshop next, we bring back an outreach plan so we can stay on track on that timeline to end the RP2, WVR2. I know, some of us have talked about, making sure that happens in a timely manner. So we come to some consensus there among ourselves and with the community by our September deadline, and we're not here looking for an expansion of that time or having to deal with those kinds of questions or having to deal with a pressure from development before we've finished those questions. So those would be, my main concern is to stop making commuter subdivisions, we have to also think about not lowering the quality of life anymore for people who are already here while we talk about growth, talk about however many are coming you want to talk about, but we're going to have to figure out how to accommodate them in ways that where we can all afford the infrastructure capacity that they will take, and they will not lower the quality of life for the people that are already here and lengthen their commute and overcrowd their schools and lower the water pressure in their faucets and expand the time that it takes for fire rescue to get to them. So that's my concerns. Thank you.
Commissioner White, you're recognized.
Thank you. I just want to say for the record that I think this free market phrase as it relates to housing in Hillsborough County is thrown around too much. I do believe there are communities in this nation, particularly older communities, where people maybe do gravitate to the community for a certain character, a certain architectural flavor. But I don't think that our housing stock is what brings people here to Hillsborough County. I think it's things like the weather and job opportunities. And what they often get when they arrive here is a choice of 3 floor plans from a national builder. So I see no issue at all with creating a sense of place through regulation. With respect to people just simply coming in and asking for more density, I think through a strong TDR policy, this board can just begin to say no. If we get the numbers in proper balance, talking about the number of credits sent from a sending area, the number of credits received from a receiving area, if we get those in proper balance, a landowner in a rural area can keep his or her land rural and still benefit financially through selling TDRs. The receiving landowner could then receive a density bonus through a reasonable fee for acquiring the TDR credits. I do sense strong consensus on this board for a TDR program. As a matter of policy, I want to see that continue to be pushed forward. I think we can get there with some hard work. But a good, robust TDR policy is all about steering growth where we'd like to see it from a cost perspective, and to de-incentivize growth in those areas where it doesn't make sense financially. But it's using an incentive model, a carrot and a stick model. It's not a heavy regulatory hammer. That's why I like the TDR model so much. There have been successful models, some, and admittedly in other states, but we have to figure out how it works here in Hillsborough County and get it right. And I'm confident that we can get there. And just for the record, I will say that I agree with Commissioner Hagan on the hybrid approach. I think as we begin to look at land use policy, I think it is some combination of building more density in the urban core, but taking a look at these nodes and corridors, particularly the I-4 corridor. But Lucia, I know that we've had some exciting conversations about, and it was touched on in the presentation, by the way, but in, say, the Highway 60 corridor through Brandon, for example. So those are a couple of nodes and corridors that I'd like to see some attention placed on.
Commissioner White, what helps bring people here is you have an Outback Bowl when it's 70-some-odd degrees and you're about the University of Minnesota here. That tells you something right there. Yeah. Mr. Kemp, you recognize.
Thank you. It's been a very good discussion, and I really appreciate the points that were made. I know that Commissioner White and Commissioner Hagan weren't here for the impact fees on the last workshop in the afternoon, but one of the points about that was in terms of incentivizing and the kind of growth that we want, when we keep our impact fees as low as we have, like shamefully low, not paying at all the cost of growth in any way, and also hurting our quality of life while we do it. And it's one of the reasons I think that some of the densities haven't been done. It's also a change in people's tastes in the market. But when we keep our impact fees so low, we cannot provide discounts and incentives for the type of growth that we want. But when we keep being way lower than Pasco, Manatee, and Polk, I mean, it's just I just don't understand it really why we are not making efforts to pay for our infrastructure and make a good quality of life for those that are here. And it's soon going to hit us at our tax base because we're not going to have any choices about it. It's probably maybe already happening. When you keep losing money on every single development that's made, you can't make it up by volume. You can't do anything about it. We've already lost hundreds of millions, if not $1 billion in the last decade on infrastructure that we could have had. So I think that that's an important, as well as the TDRs. These are important tools that we can use that we have not been using. And I made the example, it's very clear, in Pasco County, they are setting their fees and then they are incentivizing affordable housing by mobility fees, by doing mobility fee discounts for assemblable housing. They've identified redevelopment areas. I'm very excited, by the way, Melissa, about this whole presentation. And for the first time, I've seen these redevelopment areas. I think that those are areas to start focusing on. I don't, it is true that also the ULI one of their strongest messages were, don't build outside the urban service area at this time. And it was immediately just not acted on by this board at all the night before and since then. So the I-4 corridor, it is not to me, that is not a place. It's a major interstate that goes through there. I don't see where the opportunities are to create the kinds of things that we're talking about, true nodes. I could see a possibility around 301, like more, or the executive airport, in making that kind of an area, and really looking at that intensely as a possibility. The other thing is that I understand that there's a lot of commuters that are dropping off I-75 because it's gets congested, and they're going on to 301, where there's supposed to be a job center at 301. They take 301 down to I-4 to get into downtown from the New Tampa and Pasco areas. So I think that but I think we really have to look at that opportunity there. I like these redevelopment opportunities. And the other comments I have are just kind of a listing. I liked the minimum block size. I should say that Jeff Speck said that Tampa had the perfect block sizes, unlike many other cities, for walkability and for development. Unfortunately, sometimes in Tampa, they're blocking that grid now. And so we have to, I would like that not to happen. But also, we haven't even noted, as Commissioner Smith said, and maybe Commissioner Overman, about, I understand it's not our job, but to understand the development that's happening in the city of Tampa. And the development that's happening across the nation, as I understand by, the kinds of trends that are being watched, people preferred, and it was the only thing offered to them, the kind of development that we've done in the past. Boomers are now moving into walkable places. They're looking for condos. They're looking for a change that wasn't what was happening in the past. Millennials are also looking, and even when they look in neighborhoods, they want neighborhoods that are close in if they do single family. And they're looking, for other kinds of opportunities than this far out development with no sense of place, with, as you say, a floor plan, a national floor plan. And I think we have to really start looking at specifically how we get there. I liked it that you cited, I think we have to permanently look at having options for rural areas, for agricultural areas, that one size doesn't fit all. And I really am interested in seeing that protected. Another, as I had talked to you about, we voted on this board to do conservation easements, to ask for those over new developments when they're having to set aside open space. And I think we need to do that. That hasn't been done in the past. And it's important that we move forward with that. We have some opportunities that other communities are taking to look at, like golf courses. Like, I don't know what our requirements have been for parking for malls, if they were enforced by us. Cities are looking at their parking requirements that are now way overdone, realizing that, some work sites, some malls, the Walmart in Seminole Heights is, like half the parking lot, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of spaces aren't even used on Black Friday. I mean, I don't know what this situation looks like in unincorporated county, but I do think it's something to look at. I had talked to you about the grid, especially in Brandon. We've talked about corridor preservation, and I was like just looking through, and I'm wondering about if we can have opportunities still, and if it's possible that that would be one way to incentivize, is for the county to put in that grid, and make sure that that happens so that we can develop in there, as well as water, wastewater, septic, that we've all talked about. The other thing that I think is really important is I really want to protect our parks and trails. We had said in our comprehensive plan that they were inviolate, but they just don't seem to be. And I think we have to look at our land use categories very specifically. And I know that the city of Tampa is starting to rename all their public, quasi-public land and give it a special designation. I'm not sure how that goes, but I would really like us to start doing that to all our areas that are not ELAP areas, but our parks, our trails, all those, so that they have a special protective land use designation. And let's see, I guess that's just part of the list that I'd like us to move forward and be thinking about.
Mr. Mayor, before we get into round two here, let me, I haven't said it, I haven't asked you the question. Let me ask a question. Do we have we don't have an economist in here anywhere, do we? Here?
In the room?
In the room? No.
Doesn't look like it, no.
Okay, well, let me be hypothetical here. I've heard what everyone said, and I heard what Commissioner Smith was saying concerning the 20,000 that came here, I think from 2012, the number, those that went in the city of Tampa and those that came into the unincorporated county area. I know the ULI report said that we should not be considering extending the urban service area. It didn't say we shouldn't do it. It said we needed to look at how to do it at a certain period of time, and that's been 10 years ago now. My question is, if we start forcing more development into a developed area, such as the city of Tampa, what happens to us as a county fiscally if we don't have that development going in within the city, within the county? What happen? Any idea? Are you following me?
No, I understand the question. That's really what we've hired the external economists to help us evaluate.
Right.
And they're currently working, that's the group from FSU that's under contract through our financial advisor. So that is a key question. It's not only how much growth, it's where. So obviously, right off the bat, not being an economist, but you don't have to be to know that if more of the growth goes inside the city jurisdiction, then the county, the Board of County Commissioners is only collecting a countywide millage. And we already know that our countywide general fund is in fine shape. And it's not where our problem is. Our problem is in the unincorporated fund. So to the extent that more growth goes into the city boundaries and less into the unincorporated, it puts even greater stress on the unincorporated general fund, because impact fees cannot be used to pay for operating costs. They can only be used to pay for capital costs of future growth. So you can't even use impact fees to pay for the capital cost of existing deficiencies. So yeah, we do need to raise impact fees, but it doesn't really help on the operating side. So so I can tell you that will be a consequence of, but, you know, to Commissioner Smith's point, then there's less service to be provided in the unincorporated area.
Yeah.
So you have to kind of look at both sides.
Less service to be provided in the unincorporated area,
Yeah.
but our countywide area starts to, our unincorporated area starts to suffer.
Yeah.
And if this is the mindset that this board is going to start doing that, I think we need to invite the mayor and the city council here, because they have a lot to say if we're going to start doing that.
Mhm.
I don't know, I don't think that Mayor Castor would be jumping up and down saying, hey, push it on into the city of Tampa, because they're going to have the same problems that we would have. So if we're going to start talking about that, we need to expand this meeting to bring in the city of Tampa and start talking to them, because if that's the mindset we're doing, I don't want to be the ones that sit here on this county commission and blindside Mayor Castor and the city council.
Mhm.
I think I'm hearing that a little bit, but that's my thoughts. Commissioner Hagan, you recognize.
Thank you. I'm going to make this very brief. I agree with Commissioner Smith when she said that we definitely need to have a lot more discussion on I-4, and that's why I specifically said not to move forward now, but that we should be thoughtful, deliberate, and as Commissioner Smith said, careful as we study it and get more detailed information. It's a policy issue that should be studied for future consideration. I imagine many commissioners sitting here, if not the entire board, wishes that we had these type of in-depth policy discussions 3, 5, 10 years ago. We could have and should have planned better, and all I'm saying is let's don't make the same mistake again.
Commissioner Overman, you recognize.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions, and then just to kind of address the hybrid development idea. So I'm really curious, based on who can eventually bring back to us. I don't expect you to know this right off the top of your head, or anybody else, to tell you the truth. But what percentage of our built environment that we've done over the last 5 to 10 years has been below density, required density, that takes into account wetland mitigation? Because while we haven't met our density levels, is it because of our, we do have a Swiss cheese of wetland all around the county. So I'm really curious, where have we waived the density, the recommended density? And where do we consider making densities that we have as a recommended practice a requirement? Because while we haven't required it, they've gotten it, we've been able to allow it to happen for free for all practical purposes. There's not a cost that I'm aware of to building in a lower density. Is there a cost to saying, hi, I want to build one house instead of 5 that's recommended for our zoning? So if there's a balance between carrots and sticks, and we don't have any sticks. We've had no sticks. We have relatively low fees compared to anywhere in the state of Florida. I mean, and we have the development community saying, just tell us how much it is. We pay the fees. We want to develop here. We're creating jobs. It's a great place to live. And we keep talking about investing in our infrastructure and transit, so we want to be here. But we have no barrier to entry that encourages where we want to go. So to your point, it keeps costing us money because we have nothing that allows for the behavior to occur in the right direction. And I think that's a key element of our conversation that we can't lose. TDRs is a great way of making sure that we care for our agricultural communities and those that want to live in a rural area, and those areas that should be designated for either agriculture or conservation. We need to be able to create an incentive for that to occur. But at the same time, it won't happen if we don't have the requirement to meet the densities that we need to establish or maintain in order for it to have growth where it goes. So I'm really curious if we have that information. I don't expect to see it right now, but I'm very curious to see what percentage of our lots that have been built in the last, say, 5 years, maybe 10, but that are below the density required. And if, taking into consideration that lack of meeting that density requirement because of wetlands, I mean, if we have, that obviously is a problem. But part of the reason that's occurred is because we haven't required connectivity. They can't do it because of this, there's only this way to get into this piece of property. So, that's the only access is this point because there's no way to get from one community to another. So we've created the monster we have to deal with. But I think we can stop doing that if we figure out how our communities look like. The other question I have is what percentage of our multifamily developments over the last 5 years are free market, in terms of free market rents versus some level of affordability? if the ratio is all free market and very little in affordability metric, we've got to figure out how to swap that in our incentive plans, in our plan design, in our land code, in what we require, even if it has to be in the deed, perpetual affordability in those areas where we're investing in infrastructure and transit. And then lastly, to the point of the hybrid development, to require density, affordability, and transit, where transit is available, to sort of keep that in place. But I think the I-4 corridor, the only hesitancy I have there, because it makes sense for basically from I-4 to 92 all the way there, it makes sense to have economic development in that area because it's along a major interstate that is going between us and Orlando. We might actually have a bright line. There's rail service there. But there needs to be some respect for the conservation corridor that could provide for a wildlife corridor. Because there is a trail that's through there. There's some green area that's through there that we do need to really hold sacrosanct in order to make sure that we don't destroy the wildlife and the diversity of wildlife we have here in Hillsborough County. But those are, like I said, we don't have any requirement to get where we want to go. So it doesn't happen because it's easier to not do it. But I would really love to see what that number looks like to see if my assumption is close. Because I think we haven't required it, and we haven't charged for not meeting that guideline. So we've gotten what we've gotten. And I think we've got to change that dynamic in some way, shape, or form. And if in doing that, we raise that bar, if you don't want to do it, then give me affordable housing. I can do that. Just as an example of carrot and stick balance in our policies.
Commissioner Kemp, you recognize.
Thank you. And I'll be fast. There was a couple other things I noticed that I had wanted to raise. And one, I think we really need a redo. I don't know how they do it elsewhere, but of our land use categories. They make it impossible to work in a way that makes sense. For instance, we have a light industrial category, which you would think would be whatever, reflect light industrial, but it allows for residential. It doesn't make any sense. Our mixed use categories don't have any kind of seeming real requirements about how mixed use they have to be. And it turns out we've lost a lot of our jobs through our lack of categories. I know at least one issue came before us where the developer wanted to put in a restaurant, I think it was, or something like that. The neighborhood wanted a restaurant and not more housing, but for us to make the required land use designation, we had to take the risk that maybe they really wouldn't put a restaurant or put job-related or commercial neighborhood or whatever. So I think there's some real work that has to be done so that we can be more precise about that. And the other thing I'll just raise, and I don't know much about this, but I've been reading some about it in some other areas, are some type of agricultural trust or agricultural conservation areas, which you might be especially interested in, Commissioner White, where they actually make a purchase of the land, but that's continued to be used for agriculture in perpetuity. And I'm not exactly sure the economics, but I've gotten some literature I've read about that. So I think that might be an interesting option, because I'd like to always make sure that we have some agriculture, rural, for the foreseeable future, and not just sprawl out in expensive and unsustainable way.
Commissioner Hagan, you recognize.
Thank you, and this will be quick. I agree with Commissioner Oberman and Commissioner White's comments, but I just have to say that after being in this seat as long as I have, I don't know what the percentage is, but time and time and time again, when we've had an infill development rezoning, I would imagine it's maybe 10 to 20% of the time has this board approved what is legally allowable. And that's just, I know it's anecdotal, but that's just reality. And the bottom line is, whether you're talking about infill development or connectivity for that matter, existing neighborhoods do not want it. And so, and historically, this board has capitulated and approved what the neighborhoods want. And that simply cannot continue. I mean, it just can't. So that's why I do believe, and again, I'm using Mr. Merrill's terms, but a hybrid approach is the appropriate route. I know that we do not historically have motions or take votes at workshops, so I don't know if you guys have the direction you need, or if stuff has to come back, or if we need to waive the rules and take vote. I don't know. But
I think we're good. This has been very helpful, yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
that's it. Thank you.
Yes.
Anything else, Ms. Oneida?
Nothing else for me. Thank you so much for all your feedback.
Ms. Garces, anything else? No?
Can I? There we go.
You can plan, but you can't push a button.
It's a planner, Mike said. Commissioners, no, truly, thank you. Two really good meetings and just a lot of good energy, so we're grateful to all of you. Thank you.
Mr. Merrill?
Do we have a plan for the TDR lady?
Yes, thank
Okay.
you. Thank you for reminding me, if I could. At the last meeting, you had requested two speakers to come today. One was someone from the Housing Coalition and someone from the university to speak on TDRs. Given how packed this agenda was and the short time frame to invite them, we were not able, A, to get them, but B, we thought it might be helpful to have folks who deal with specific tools come in once we get a lot of these policy questions underway. So our recommendation would be that after February 6th, if there is the TDR lady, Professor Van Linkus
I'm
from
sorry,
USF.
I just cannot remember her name. It's the TDR lady.
Or I think the other one that you had recommended was Jamie Ross from the Housing Coalition, or whoever, that those kinds of speakers come after we get some of the policy out for public review, and then they are able to come in and talk to us about specific tools and how they've worked, because it won't be too late. It will be a nice matchup.
The reason I ask is I ran into at the sustainability conference over in Pinellas this week, which I got a chance to run in, see lunch, talk to people, and run out the door. But I ran into Taryn Sabian and with Cutter, and she has presented to all the counties around us, but not us, the research they've done on transit transit-oriented development, and the tools and techniques for incorporating that in your land code. I was going to put it on the next BOCC agenda to do that presentation, because I think it needs to be done to incorporate our mindset, because we talk about it, but I'm not sure we know how to implement it. But I didn't want it to run it off so far down the schedule that it didn't have a reference to the conversation we're having in our workshops. So I'm willing to wait if we can slide it in, but I would like to have it happen soon.
Yeah,
So-
I think Taryn would be a very good one on transit-oriented development.
Okay. Well, I'll put it on the next BOCC agenda.
That, or then the other piece would be kind of in a speaker series that happens in February, where we have Jamie Ross, where we have Professor Van Linkus, and then maybe Taryn. Would that be,
All in the
maybe-
same room at the same time? We would get a lot done, wouldn't we?
Well, that's the other option, is to do it in a kind of a panel discussion about various tools that could work.
And that would be an excellent one to invite the city, because they're dealing with the same issues. I mean, honestly, they are. They're dealing with affordable housing issues. They're dealing with TOD issues, zoning issues.
And maybe that's up on the 26th floor in truly a workshop format, where there is just kind of a different informal ability to engage in conversation.
Is that something
But we'll
you
give it
would
a think
see
for
an
you,
option?
and then we'll bring, we'll talk to you, and we'll bring
Okay.
something back.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let me thank each and every one of you for being here today. I think that this has been a good meeting. I think we're coming closer together than we are apart. I believe we're getting a mindset that we're doing well-planned growth and not stopping growth or shifting it on someone else's lap. So I think that's where we are. And thank you for bearing with me. I'm not feeling that great today. But I think we're going to get there. We're going to get there eventually. If we have no other business, we'll adjourn.